The following is an AZPM original production.
Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, mental health care in the justice system. When a year-long investigation of the Pima County Jail gave the public concrete evidence of crumbling buildings and inadequate health care, many were frustrated. But the county decided a new jail was too expensive. The whole process left those closest to the system with more questions than answers. In particular, how is the county's failing justice infrastructure going to adapt to a community with increasing levels of mental illness and chronic health problems? AZPM partnered with Arizona Luminaria for 18 months to tell the story of one man as he navigates the justice system while struggling with mental illness for over 20 years. Pat's family has spent thousands of dollars and immeasurable amounts of emotional energy supporting him, but in a system that lacks empathy and prioritizes punishment, not prevention. AZPM's Hannah Cree and AZ Luminaria's John Washington take it from here.
When mental health makes day-to-day function difficult, facing eviction from your home can turn a tough situation into a nightmare.
What do I think? I'm dismayed. I've been made homeless by the city of Tucson.
That was Pat Grenier, a lifelong Tucsonan who lost his house in the middle of a mental health crisis a few years ago. His family believes Pat has frontotemporal dementia, a rare form of the disease that manifests in personality changes and lack of self-awareness. Although his family is still struggling to get an official diagnosis for dementia, he's battled bipolar disorder and schizoaffective disorder for at least the last decade. His daughter, Brianna Grenier, says that when things are bad,
the dominant symptom or tell of his mental illness is he has these very grandiose thoughts. He thinks he's a U.S. Marshal. The cartel's out to get him.
Brianna says her dad's ups and downs don't define him.
When he is well and stable, he is my most favorite person in the world.
But it's important to note that throughout our time with Pat, he repeatedly denied having any of the mental illnesses we described in this piece. Before his disease deteriorated, Pat had long periods of stability. Brianna told us about his career in one of the many phone calls we had with the family throughout 2024.
He was very, very talented woodworker and craftsman, and I know he's very, very proud of that.
One impact of Pat's mental illness is that it makes day-to-day responsibilities harder. Pat's brother-in-law, James Baker, says Pat was effectively kicked out of his own home in 2022. He missed a few utility payments after he started believing the utility companies were run by oligarchs. In an interview with the both of them in 2023, James says the house was deemed unfit for occupancy after the water and electricity were turned off.
The city says, you don't have services, your house is condemned.
No trespassing.
You have to get out of your house, no trespassing, unfit for occupancy. So they make someone homeless who owns a home.
The city of Tucson denies Pat's claim that they made him homeless. The condemnation report from the city says Pat violated the codes about vegetation overgrowth and debris around his house, as well as letting junk vehicles stay on his property. Christina Polsgrove, with the city of Tucson's Department of Environmental and General Services, said condemning the house was a matter of public safety, and there was a history of problems at his house. She said condemnation isn't a final decision, and occupants can move back in as long as they fix the code violations, restore utilities, and receive a certificate of occupancy. Both Tucson Electric Power and Tucson Water have payment assistance programs that can help people avoid eviction. But if you think oligarchs control the utilities, it's easy to fall through the cracks, and even harder to fix a housing crisis once you're in one. Keith Bentley studies homelessness for the Southwest Institute for Research on Women. He explains how mental illness adds a layer of complication.
But if you think about needing to be really on top of getting in line to maybe get a service, and then you have to meet eligibility criteria and submit paperwork and things like that to get that. Again, if you're experiencing a mental health crisis and you're so depressed you can barely get out of bed, then it's very unlikely you're going to be able to negotiate that system.
During one emergency room visit at Tucson Medical Center, doctors told Brianna that Pat was neither a danger to himself or others, and there was nothing they could do but let him go home. Brianna implored them that that wasn't true.
Because he is incapable of taking care of himself. He is incapable of usual, routine, adult responsibilities. And therefore, he is a danger to himself because he is slowly killing himself. He's killing himself in another way.
Housing is just one problem Pat and his family have had to navigate. The other is the justice system. In 2019, Pat was arrested in his driveway after a dispute with a neighbor. During the arrest, Pat says Tucson Police Department officers broke his hip after tackling him on the concrete. In video footage from the arrest, Pat is screaming in pain.
Okay. Is anything else hurting on you?
Pat and his family say he has lasting injuries from the takedown.
I've got new metal rods, horizontal and vertical, into my leg and head. Along the way there, that assault, which changed my life forever. I planned to work as a carpenter till 72.
We reached out to TPD about the incident. They said Pat's complaint went through the Office of Professional Standards for an internal review. In an email, Sergeant Richard Gradius wrote that the arresting officer, Jose Galvan, had seen a physical altercation between Pat and his neighbor, which caused Pat to fall. He then alleges Pat resisted arrest, and that Pat mentioned a recent surgery on his hip. But Pat's family says that's not true. According to James, Pat's hip had never been broken before that incident, and the injury was caused from what he calls a forceful takedown from behind. The Office of Professional Standards concluded the investigation of Pat's complaint and ruled the allegations they caused Pat's injuries to be unfounded. Today, Pat still wears a back brace from the encounter, but his family has not pursued further legal action.
Law enforcement's response is only one part of the problem. Pat's family says he never quite recovered from the 2019 takedown with TPD, and losing his house actually caused more citations to stack up. When he lost his house for the last time in 2022, a major consequence was that Pat could no longer receive mail. When the post office stopped delivering to his house, James says he missed critical notices from his insurance in the courts.
They would send notices of your court date to his address, which then ended up going nowhere. It took a period of time before we realized all that.
According to the family's accounts and arrest records, Pat has had at least 4 warrants out for failure to appear, or FTA. An FTA was what prompted Pat's latest stay in the Pima County Jail in March 2023. During a stint of court-ordered treatment at Tucson Medical Center, Pat ran away, and hospital staff called the police to find him. He was arrested and taken to the jail when the police officer found a warrant for failing to show up for a court date. Because of his history of failing to appear to court, Pat's attorney told James that the safest place to keep his brother-in-law was the jail. He was horrified. We sat down with Brianna and James the day after yet another death was reported at the Pima County Jail in 2023.
Because you're seeing in the news another death at the Pima County Adult Detention Center, and then you see another death, and then one death at the mental health unit. So, really? And you're telling me that's the best place where he can be right now? But what's the alternative?
Amelia Kramer, vice president of the NAACP Tucson chapter, says the failure to appear cycle keeps vulnerable people trapped in a traumatic environment.
The primary reason people to fail to appear for the next court hearing is due to poverty, mental illness, or substance use disorder. The vast majority of folks have been arrested for low-level, nonviolent misdemeanors.
Shortly after that arrest, Pat's lawyer filed a Rule 11 petition. That's Arizona's legal procedure for determining whether someone is mentally competent to stand trial. In the 2 months he waited in jail for his Rule 11 hearing, Pat turned 70. Finally, in May 2023, the Arizona Superior Court found that Pat was incompetent. The court ordered him to be held in the jail without bond until his next hearing in October, guaranteeing another 4 months in the jail.
It's filthy just deplorable conditions. John, I can't tell you how horrible it is. And they put me in there with wife beaters, narcotics dealers, and murderers, and people who said they were going to kill me.
At his hearing, he was also referred to the county's Restore to Competency Program, or RTC. It's specifically for individuals like Pat who have been deemed, quote, incompetent but restorable. According to data from the county's Behavioral Health Department, 128 people passed through the RTC program in 2023, which is the most it has seen in the last 5 years. The general manager of the RTC program explained to us that those in the program receive the same services as other people in the jail. The main difference is the jail's healthcare contractor allegedly provides a psychiatrist designated only to people in the program.
But the issue for activists like Kramer is the restoration program happens inside the jail, which is not a restorative place. 8 people died in the jail in 2023, according to the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, triggering intense community backlash. In 2024, that number dropped to 1 after the county expanded addiction treatment in the jail. But, Kramer says, healing is not a goal of the RTC program.
Restoration to competency is not treatment for mental illness. It is simply medication and education to get the person ready to be able to participate in the defense at their trial. This is not to make them better.
In September 2023, Pat was beaten up by his cellmate. Jail records documenting the assault report he had redness and swelling under his left eye. In jail grievance forms we obtained through a public records request, Pat wrote he was hungry, complained of a filthy cell, and beatings from corrections officers. He also contracted bronchitis in the jail, and his jail records show multiple transports to the hospital.
It don't make sense that I'm denied privileges and roughed up along the way and looked down upon by these so-called professionals. I know how to seek help, but when I ask for it, it's not there.
The Pima County Sheriff's Department told us that our subject was likely giving us false information when we approached them about Pat's complaints. The county claims its program consisting of medication, legal education, and psychological evaluation is more specialized. But Pat said that didn't matter. He was still locked up.
I felt that I had no hope of ever getting out again, to enjoying the fresh air and the breeze on my scalp and looking about the scenery. I didn't think I'd ever see that again.
In a 2023 interview with Brianna and James, while Pat was still in jail, they said not being able to visit him in person and only being able to make infrequent video calls with him was heartbreaking.
Oftentimes I feel numb, if I'm being totally honest, just because the heartbreak and the overwhelm is a lot. To realize that, he can't look at the moon, or he can't meet family for coffee or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so I have not found the best way to be. I am here. That is often my response, is that I am here.
Kramer says keeping people in jail who are only facing sentences of probation is a mistake.
See, someone who's committed a serious sexual assault should not be released from the jail while they're being restored to competency. But someone who's committed one of these low-level misdemeanors or been booked again on a failure to appear could certainly be released from the jail to treatment services at a mental health facility in the community or to supportive housing in the community while they're being restored to competency. But that's not happening.
Pat's story is not an anomaly. According to county data, a third of the jail's population was on long-term psychiatric medication, and jail workers are performing an average of 400 mental health evaluations a month. The only thing Pima County lawmakers agree on is the problem itself, but everyone has different opinions on what that change should look like. At the top, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos agrees a lot of the people who have committed low-level crimes would be better off somewhere else.
I have no say who can come in there or who gets to come and go. But my opinion is we still have a lot of them in there who shouldn't be there, that there's other places for them. The restorative competency program, I think, adds to that problem. I have a guy who steals a bike at 3 a.m, and he comes in, and if he'd have just pled guilty, he'd have been out in 2 or 3 days. Instead, because he's got some real mental health issues, they hold him in my jail till he has his restoration competency, which is 6 months down the road for it to be evaluated.
But Nanos also thinks that accommodating too much is sending the wrong message, as Nanos told AZPM later in 2024, as the county was debating spending $800 million on a new jail.
But to build an entire facility around thousand aides, you're telling your community, those out in the world who deal with this, that you want services, you got to be arrested first. And that's the image I want to avoid.
Others suggest starting at the first responder level, often because it's the officer's choice whether to take an individual in crisis to treatment or to jail. Tucson Police Department's Mental Health Service Team, or MIST, is a squad of 9 police officers who exclusively deal with those calls in the community. But the most severe crises are still left up to regular patrol officers to deal with. Officer Joshua Godfrey explains the MIST team's most common assignment is serving amendments, as he explains.
What's called an amendment, and those are people who are already put on a court-ordered treatment plan, but they're either symptomatic or not following their treatment plan. And so their mental health provider will send a form to the court that, again, gets stamped by a judge that comes to our unit as an order to go pick that person up and take them to a facility, get put back on their treatment plan, and that's typically going to be the Crisis Response Center.
Sergeant Jason Winsky started the team 10 years ago. He says 2023 statistics show that the group doesn't take people into custody often.
We had over 2,000 unique engagements with people in crisis in the community, and we only arrested one person the entire year.
MIST officers are trained in de-escalation strategies and hostage negotiation. But Godfrey says most of what he knows about mental health treatment comes from his years of working the streets.
A mental health investigation is not that dissimilar from like a criminal investigation. Instead of looking for probable cause to arrest somebody, we're looking for indications that they're a danger to themselves, danger to others, gravely disabled, or persistently acutely disabled.
Sergeant Winsky says reform is a slow process, and the system of diversion from jail is far from perfect, due to the limits of the team and challenging situations.
Because I think, it boils down to each individual officer or deputy's discretion, right? So every single one of those situations is unique. There's a million ways, unfortunately, that diversion and deflection can work, and there's a million ways that it can fall through the cracks.
Officers told us there's a significant backlog of cases, and the demand from the community continues.
Oh my gosh, we could have 5 teams, 24/7.
You're listening to The Buzz. The story continues after the break.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.
Welcome back to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week's episode features a long-running collaboration between AZPM's Hannah Cree and AZ Luminaria's John Washington, looking into how mental health issues are treated in the Pima County Jail. John takes us back into the story.
In our time with Pat, we were able to see the first-hand impacts of a broken system. But at the same time, we barely scratched the surface. Experts told us reform is necessary in almost every area of the cycle that kept Pat stuck. The courts, law enforcement, mental health services in the community, as well as treatment in the jail. Families like Pat's are still looking for solutions. According to Kramer, inertia is the biggest challenge in bureaucracies.
And so what we really need is collaboration between the city and the county, all of the government agencies, along with private community-based providers to create a new system. And yes, it's work, and the thing I've heard, like you've heard, is it's not my job. Well, it isn't anybody's job, and that's part of the problem. But when people all come together, they can make change happen in a positive way.
Pat was found unrestorable in October 2023 and released from jail. Then it was on to another mental health treatment facility, but he escaped and was missing for almost a week. In the months since, he has bounced around at least 9 different boarding houses. His family is doing all they can, but Pat is unpredictable, and they worry about another incident sending him back through the jail system. With the county at a standstill about how to improve its own behavioral health care and those in charge denying responsibility, it seems the only way to survive the system is by having someone in your corner.
In Pat's case, James and his wife Susan Baker became his conservators last year, effectively becoming responsible for him. James says much of his life over the last few years has been spent chasing different agencies on the phone, insurance companies, the county's behavioral health, social workers, TPD, the court system. It's a full-time and emotionally taxing job.
There's an extreme learning curve in all of this. And I've been finding out by making, I don't know how, literally hundreds and hundreds of phone calls and conversations with various people.
Because of his multiple citations, Pat lost his private health care and Social Security, making it even harder for his family to help him. On top of that, Pat still doesn't have an official dementia diagnosis. Despite the fact that psychiatrists within the RTC program made notes of dementia symptoms, that's only enough to find him unrestorable, and doesn't qualify as an official legal diagnosis, which James says they need in order to access much-needed financial assistance from the Arizona healthcare cost containment system.
This is a tremendous undertaking. Financially, we've expended a little over $5,000 so far, just to this point.
Brianna says there's no telling where Pat would be right now in a system that seems stacked against the most vulnerable.
He's been allowed to fall through these cracks where these institutions that he is designated to and entrusted in care of have just let him go to the wayside. And again, he has folks in his corner advocating for him, trying to keep tabs on him, trying to help him, and communicating with these entities.
You got bread pudding there? On a visit to Pat's house last summer, he showed us drawings and notes he wrote on scrap paper during his last day in the jail.
We're going to go to the right, through this archway.
He said it was hard for him to get writing materials, and he wrote most of his thoughts on jail release pamphlets, medical forms, or whatever else he could get a hold of.
This was a pamphlet that was handed out along with this on how to get by on the outside world. This is the name of the guidebook.
Yeah.
But I took advantage of every single piece of paper. But a lot of this, I had a short stub of a pencil and could barely see what I was writing.
One note reads, "The system is flawed. How can I succeed without some sort of aid from the outside?"
Now, nearly 2 years later, Pat's family is still working within the system to try to get him the long-term care that he needs.
Joining me now in the studio are the reporters who put that story together, AZPM's Hannah Cree and AZ Luminaria's John Washington. Hannah and John, we got some idea of the timescale of this story over the last almost 25 minutes. It's a really long time that you both spent working on this. Are there details about that process that Pat and his family went through that didn't make it into the story? And Hannah, we'll start with you on that.
Definitely things that we wanted to include but didn't, for time constraints, couldn't make it in. One of those that is really top of mind for me was the fact that Pat and his family really struggled to get him glasses inside the jail. Day-to-day function is more difficult when you can't see, and they didn't let him bring his existing glasses in. And, the jail bureaucracy is a whole nother, that's a phone tree. That's maybe you're running into a corrections officer that's been on the job for 6 months and they don't quite, get how things work. James was describing that was a big barrier.
To underscore sort of probably the principal takeaway for a lot of people is the difficulty throughout this entire process. It was a hard story to report. It was a hard story to live through. And there is so many challenges, so many hurdles, so many speed bumps, so many dead ends that Pat, his family, and so many other people who are in a similar situation or even brushing into the system briefly have to try to navigate. And it is really, each of the systems is complex in its own right. And when you put them all together, it gets even more complex. And I think the level of difficulty in trying to wrap our heads around this problem is why the problem exists in some regards. And a lot of the public officials and experts that we spoke with say, like, look, nobody is really claiming responsibility because they've all been able to point to another agency, and the agencies and the different systems just aren't working together very well. And that's something that I think about a lot.
One of the things that really struck me as I've talked with you both over the last 18 months as you've been looking at this and listening to the multiple versions that became what is this show that came through, but there's so much more to it, is the impact on Pat's family. We focus on Pat, but so much was going on with his family also that was caused by all of this.
Yeah. I don't know if they gave us a final dollar amount, but this cost them, just trying to understand the system, I mean, thousands and thousands of dollars. Pat has a sister and brother-in-law and other family members who worked effectively full-time jobs at various points, trying to get him insurance back, trying to understand the best process of getting him out of the jail or deciding to keep him in the jail, as we reported, trying to find him any sort of services, mental health services, when he was on the outside. And they readily acknowledge that they are relatively privileged. They have some means, and they have, like very high literacy in navigating these things, but not everyone has the time or the means to dedicate what they have. So they're lucky in many regards.
That was the biggest personal impact that I felt reporting this story, is the sacrifice that a family makes when just one member of that family becomes incapable of caring for themselves. When you're working full time, I know Brianna was working full time, and honestly, just making one phone call to an insurance company to make it so you can pay a singular bill, that can take, an uncalculable amount of mental energy. And to deal with that for years and years on end with, insurance is just one example, but bureaucracy of the jail, all the systems that we're describing in this piece, it's overwhelming just for a reporter to witness it from the outside.
Mental and emotional energy.
Absolutely.
The emotional weight that they carried when numerous different people in city and county counseled them to leave Pat in jail. And they knew he was there, and they knew that it was in part their decision to do that. And it was very hard for them. The first time we interviewed them together, he was still in jail, and it was very, very apparent that was weighing very heavily on them.
I remember that interview. It was in the studio right across the hall from us, and that was what we often refer to as an intense interview, but it wasn't intense anger. It was just, you could feel the emotion coming through the glass and through the walls, for them. It was, quite the experience, to say the least. John, you touched on this a little bit a minute ago about the difficulties that you two had, of course, just dealing with the emotional part of it, but the practical part of reporting something like this with so many different moving parts. That's something we as listeners don't always get to hear about.
Yeah, there really are a lot of moving parts, and a lot of people right now, when they're entering into Department of Corrections in Arizona, or sometimes the jail, their insurance basically is suspended for a short time. And I've been talking with people recently as well, and that is not always reinstated immediately upon leaving. And that is one of myriad difficulties, trying to make sure that people have continuity of care. And when you're dealing with mental health, when you're dealing with substance abuse, that continuity of care can be a life or death situation. So making sure that people have insurance, and that is, I'm cherry picking here one of the dozens and dozens and dozens of things that we encountered, saying like, oh my gosh, how do you, this is, the questions that Pat's family was asking themselves, how do we make sure that his insurance is reinstated? After his house was condemned, how do we make sure that he's able to get mail from the insurance company? Because we didn't even know that their insurance was cut off. How do we try to understand what sort of mental health or basic medical care he has access to in the jail? And these are all different systems, not to mention the courts, that they have to try to figure out. And they don't, as you said recently, they don't all intersect in proper ways. And this is why, as Sheriff Nanos has repeatedly called out, our jail has now become effectively the largest mental health institution that we have locally.
Hannah, anything that's stuck out to you, difficulties in the reporting of all of this?
On a smaller level, we basically had to navigate Pat's mental health issues from a removed perspective, but the same ups and downs that his family is also going through, because at one point he went missing for at least a month and he wasn't answering phone calls, but his family also didn't know where he was either. So navigating those family dynamics, trying to practice empathy, but also this story is really important, and his story was such a great example. Like, I think in editing we brought up almost all agencies in Pima County. They were all mentioned at one capacity or the other. I learned so much over the past 18 months.
To, explain what the consequences are for going missing for someone like Pat, it's not just that the family's worried or that he himself might be, out in the streets or potentially extra vulnerable, but the reason he went into the jail for the last time is because he couldn't make his court date, because he was missing for a little bit. He left the hospital where he was supposed to be receiving treatment, and he didn't show up for court. That is a felony, and that is why he was in jail for the last time. And this is happening to hundreds of people a year, where just the mere fact of not being able to make a court date, and a lot of that stems from having a mental illness, they are punished for it. And that is one of the things that I think was readily and very poignantly apparent in reporting this story.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago. It's that intersection of things that should be intersecting but don't, and then you have to navigate not just one bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy of insurance, of city government, of county government, of banking, of healthcare, all those things.
How can anyone do it without a family like Pat's?
Yeah.
That was my takeaway.
An interesting definition from Hannah Arendt is bureaucracy is really ruled by no one. And I think that is something that the family sort of felt. It's so dissipated who can respond to some of their basic questions that they are given the runaround such that they never get an answer, never get a proper answer. And this is not over. I mean, Pat is still needing services. He still could have another run-in with the law, and he could end up back in jail. And that's something that is, I think, a present concern for the family.
All right. Well, Hannah, John, thank you for a year and a half of reporting. As you said, John, this isn't over. It's the end of our story for today, but it is not the end of Pat's story or anybody else's story who is in a similar situation. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And that's the buzz for this week. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcast. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Zach Ziegler is our producer with production help from Maggie Farmer. Our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
Like this podcast? Your support makes AZPM original productions like this one possible. Donate at azpm.org/give.